Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to go into part 2 of the series about Dash and Plotly, and we're going to first demo the application that we're actually going to be creating, and then secondly we're going to do the ever necessary setup and installation of what we need to get things started. So in the last video we talked a lot about the basic layout, we demonstrated some of the functionality that you can get, we talked about two things, the Dash core components and the HTML components. So I'm going to do a quick recap of what we did in the last video, but first I think it's more interesting to see the app that we're going to be building and just play around with it a little bit, and then we'll jump back into reviewing what we did last time. Alright, so let's get to it. So you can see on my screen here, this is the application we'll be building. It's a simple map at the top. You got an interactive graph on the bottom. And the basic layout, the basic interactivity here is when you click on one of these points on the graph, one of these stations, it will refresh the time series on the bottom. Alright, so what we're looking at here is ozone data. This comes from the CASTNET data set collected by the EPA. It's a really good data set, has ozone, temperature, relative humidity. Here we're just looking at ozone, but you can clearly extend this to look at others. You know, you could, for example, put a drop-down menu somewhere on the website here. But I think the nice part about it is it looks clean, it's simple, and it gets us started to learn how to do a few things with Dash and Plotly. For example, how to make a graph, first and foremost. That's what you see here on the bottom. How to make that graph responsive to click events. So that's another thing we'll be talking about. And also general layout of the application. So just to get a feel for how we might lay out an application. Here you see we have a sidebar over here. We have a link, some basic HTML kind of stuff. And again, styling this kind of graph to make it look nice. So those are the basic things, but I think it should give you a flavor for how to make a really simple, cool, and what I think is a pretty elegant looking application without not much work. Alright, so that's the application side. Let's jump back to a quick review of what we did in the last video, and I think that'll be helpful for us to get our bearings of where to begin. Alright, let's go over here to handy dandy Sublime. There it is. Alright, so in the last video we talked about three main parts of an application. The first part is just instantiating the application, so just creating a Dash application instance. Second, where you put the meat or the components of your application. In particular here, I call it the page body. Usually I just call it entire page just because I'm lazy, but this is where we name things. So if you go back to our actual application, these are components like the map itself, things like this logo here that I took from the EPA, you know, this header, this link component, these dividers, this text. So you see there's many components, and we're going to have to compose those onto the page, and that all will be going into the app layout section. Alright, back to Sublime. So that was one. Then the callbacks. And the callbacks, like I said, this is the really cool part of Dash, is the callbacks provide you that interactivity. So there's only really a few pieces of interactivity that we have in this website. Actually, I think only one. Yeah, only one piece of interactivity here. And that is when you click on the map, there's a response with the graph below. So there's not a lot of interactivity here, but it should give you a flavor for how to set those up. Alright, and that's where that will go. So now that you have a flavor for all that, the thing that we need to cover in this video is how to set up your environment. So how can you actually work and create something like the application we saw here. Alright, so let me open up a terminal window. There we go. Here I'm actually running the application. So before we start talking about installing packages and what we need to pull and install, let's just walk through what we have. Alright, so to run the application, I just called it app.py. You can see it right down here. And with app.py, in order to run this application and get it working in the browser, you would do py.app. Now this is the full featured application that I showed, so the one with the map and the graph on the bottom. If you tried to run that template that I saw, the sort of outline of what we're going to be building, it would just fail because there's nothing to render. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of how easy it is to run the application. Now let's talk about installation. So to install Dash and all of its features, it's really quite simple. Here I'll just go to the website, Dash Users Guide, and like any good tool on the web, it has really good documentation. First things first, part 1, you see installation. So just click on that, and it'll actually give you the pip commands to install. Now, one good rule of thumb when you'll be installing packages on your system is to work with virtual environments. If you don't know about virtual environments, it's just a way of helping separate a package for a particular application you're making or some piece of software you're writing. That way the versions don't start overlapping. So let's say you're developing 2 or 3 pieces of software at a time. You want to make sure that the thing that you're developing right now works the same every single time. And one thing that oftentimes will break your app is if you have conflicting versions of packages you've installed. So one typical package may be you have an older version of NumPy. NumPy is a math library in Python. Well, that older version of NumPy may work really well with the software you've developed. However, you might be, when you upgrade, your software might not work. So virtual environments help you compartmentalize it. I'll show you what I mean real quick before, just as a sidebar about virtual environments. You see this env in parentheses on the side here? This means I'm running in a virtual environment. Here I type in deactivate. And maybe for our purposes here, just to keep it illustrative, I will deactivate that. Let's just create a new virtual environment and install these things from scratch, just for our own sake, own edification. So you type in virtualenv. Hopefully you have virtual environments already installed. And usually I like to specify explicitly with which Python version I'm working with. So in this case, Python 3. And then you name the environment. So this is going to be a directory that's going to be created, and several subdirectories are going to be in it. So I'm going to give it a unique name. That way it becomes clear that we're creating a new directory by invoking this command. So here we're going to do, I don't know, example. Usually you name it something like env, or name it the application name you're working with. Depends on your personal preference there. So if I just do this, here it's saying, you know, installing a few things. You say new executable, and if I look in my directory space, you'll see there's something called example, just like we named it here. If we go into example, you'll see what it created was bin. These are your binaries. Include, lib, and share. All right. Now we haven't actually entered our virtual environment yet. To get in there, you do source bin activate. All right. Now we have sort of this clean environment. And the way to check that it's clean, do a pip freeze, for example. This will tell you all the packages that are installed in this environment. And you'll see all we have here is package resources. So that means we have a clean environment to start work with. Let's start installing Dash. All right. So what I want to do is literally just grab these. And as of recording this video, just as a side note, here it has this thing called Dash DAC, which I have not worked with. It says newly open source. I'm going to go ahead and install it anyway. It shouldn't cause a problem. But also, there's a new thing that I saw on the website that Dash is also included, and it's not included in this list here, but it's something called crypto something. It's about graphical models. Maybe something I'll touch on in the future. I think it's quite interesting. I haven't played around with it yet. All right, so go back to our command line. I'm going to paste these. Here we go. As you can see, it's installing those packages. All right, so while that installs, I just want to recap. All we're doing here is setting up the environment, and then we're going to jump into how to create our first very simple application. I'm not going to go really deep into this video. For the next video, we'll talk about things like layout and how to organize some of the directories. So here you see it finished installing everything. Fantastic, except for this DAC. I think it's pronounced DAC. Maybe, I don't know. DAC. All right, I'm going to copy over the template we had. Dash tutorial basic outline. Here's our basic outline. I'm going to copy that over. Let's open that up just to take a look at it. Here's our basic template. And just to make sure that everything worked correctly, we're going to put in a really dumb thing in here. Children equals it's a me. And we're going to render that template. I don't have any callbacks. Actually, I wonder if it's going to throw an error. I mean, let's give that a try. Maybe it'll work. Doot, doot. Yes, I use Emacs like a boss. Let's see what happens. Yeah, can't import event. Of course, can't import event because event doesn't exist anymore. It's been deprecated. There we go. Python basics. Boop. All right, let's see if that works. Go and hit this URL up. Copy. Actually, let's just go and refresh it. And as you can see, it just says, it's a me. Simple enough. So now we got a dash application running, a very boring one, but one is running. So that's basically what you would do to get your application up and running. Let's go back here. Let's kill this. And let's spend just a second here outlining what a simple callback would look like. So here I did not give this thing an ID. But if I wanted to use it in a callback, I would give this an ID. So let's call this simple text. All right, so now I've named this div. This div just contains some text, so children is just the text that's going to be within it. This could also just be a list of other components in your application. So this is all that my app contains, so it can't really call back anything interesting. What can we do to make it interesting? Let us go ahead and define app.callback. Output. And this is how you would specify that callback. So the output here, I'm saying whatever this action I want to have taken, it's going to affect the simple text ID. And I want it to affect its child here. Actually, I need to wrap that in quotes. All right. Now, when is this change going to occur? Oops. And notice I'm putting this in a list. Input, and this is going to be another thing. And just for the sake, we'll make this another boring div. This is just to illustrate the point. Diff, and we'll say do something. All right, do something. And what this is going to accept here in this function is whatever this input is. So we can name this whatever we want, but just know that this is input. So when we click off of that, you can just say this is this child input. Just to be clear. I'm being excessively verbose here because I want to be clear about what is happening in the callback. And then in here you could do whatever you want. So this child, oh, I want to do it. We'll say return this child input plus 1. It's a really dumb thing to do, but let's do that. So we're going to essentially, what this silly, ridiculous callback is doing. Yeah, let's keep it that way. HTML div. Children. Here, I'm just going to make 2 children. So one is our original it's a me statement. And the next one will be ID equals children, and we'll just leave this to be some stuff because I'm incredibly creative today. Another thing. Great. All right, so now we have 2 things. Oh, I need to close off my pencil there. 2 things contained within a div. I have 2 divs here, so just 2 boring old divs. And one of them is input for another. So what do you think is going to happen in this callback? It seems kind of silly, but there's a note here about how Dash is going to treat things. Should I just show it to you, or should I tell you the answer? Let's just look at the answer. All right. So if we go back to our application, boop, reloading. So I reloaded it. Oh, wait a minute. I printed some stuff because it's some stuff plus 1. That's strange. Now why on earth would it do that? Print some stuff twice. That's interesting. Well, I'm going to kill this here. So what the application is doing is whenever you've loaded your app, this is something to note about callbacks, probably a nuance that we will become more familiar with down the road, but whenever you start your application, it fires off all of those callbacks. So what you see in our app layout are 2 statements, right? We see this one coming from simple text, it's a me, which we never saw when we launched this application, and another one that just says some stuff. Now when I loaded it, what we saw was the first line said some stuff 1, which is the return value of our callback, and the line below it just said some stuff. And the reason for that is because when you start your application, it automatically fires off the callback. So what we never saw, what we saw immediately happen in the code was replacing the original text we had with that of the callback, the return of the callback. And that's where we got the same text, some stuff, plus 1 in our first line, which sits in the simple text div. All right, so that's just to give you a flavor for how things work, getting things installed, and also demoing the application we'll be doing. It's going to be a lot more fascinating once we get into how to do the layout and also start adding that interactivity to be far more interesting than this silly little example. But I hope that gave you a feel for how the application process is going to work. Stay tuned in the next video. We're going to get a lot more interesting. I'm going to add some cool stylings, and we'll talk about how to further lay out our application. Great. Hit the like button if you like it, and thanks for watching.